What if the greatest life coach who ever lived never opened a social media account? What if the answers to fear, betrayal, success, failure, purpose, leadership, relationships, and resilience were written thousands of years ago, and most people simply walked past them? Here at Beyond Verses, we will do a deep dive into an interesting book. Whether you're Christian, belong to another faith, or have no religion at all, you're welcome here. Because discovering timeless life lessons hits it in one of history's most influential books, the Holy Bible.
Intuitive approach to handling massive crises. We're breaking down what we're calling the Nehemiah strategy. It's basically a historical masterclass on how to respond when literally everything around you seems to be falling apart. So let's dive right into this and see how one ancient leader completely flips our modern script on crisis management.
I want you to picture this scenario for a second. What do you do when your house is on fire, right? If you're like most of us, panic sets in immediately. You grab a bucket, you grab a hose, you're dialing emergency services. It's an immediate, totally physical reaction to a physical problem. But our historical subject today, Nehemiah, did something entirely different when he got the devastating news that the walls of Jerusalem were completely destroyed. He didn't grab a metaphorical bucket. He grabbed something else entirely.
To really grasp how bizarre his reaction seems to our modern minds, take a look at what Nehemiah didn't do. He didn't call an urgent board meeting. He didn't try to muster up some military defense or, kick off a fundraising campaign to buy bricks. And he certainly didn't just post the ancient equivalent of pray for Jerusalem with a little folding hands emoji and then completely disappear. He completely ignored all the practical, military, and social steps that would seem totally obvious to us today. Which actually brings us to this hilarious but painfully accurate quote. My phone battery dropped to 2% and I entered a level of prayer I haven't reached in months. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. We usually only discover that we are these deep spiritual intercessors when the Wi-Fi drops or a sudden crisis hits, right? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it perfectly contrasts our frantic, information-seeking modern panic with Nehemiah's strategy. When a tiny problem pops up for us, before we even think about praying, we frantically call 5 friends, search Google 6 times, and watch a dozen motivational videos just to convince ourselves we're experts. But look at Nehemiah's deliberate, spiritual first response. He wept, he mourned, he fasted, and he prayed. No frantic searching. The historical record tells us exactly what happened. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept, and mourned for certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. The true gist of his prayer here wasn't just some helpless coping mechanism. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just all he could do. Rather, it was the highly strategic, intentional starting point for absolutely everything that was about to follow. Moving into our next section, dealing with the invisible, finding the root of the problem. So we are really looking past the obvious physical damage here to find the hidden issue. There are 2 distinct layers to this crisis. The visible problem was totally obvious. The physical walls of Jerusalem were broken. Anyone could see that. But Nehemiah understood something much deeper. The invisible problem was a broken relationship with God. The logic here is incredibly profound. He knew that if the people's hearts were restored first, rebuilding the physical walls of the city would naturally just follow. And that brings us to the actual words of his prayer. Listen closely to this. Both I and my Father's house have sinned. Did you catch that? People today are absolute experts at pointing fingers. We naturally want to say, hey, they messed up. But Nehemiah didn't say, Lord, those people over there ruined everything. Look at those crucial words, I and we. He didn't blame others or point fingers for the mess, even though he wasn't the one who literally knocked the walls down. So the absolutely crucial point here is this. Real restoration begins where excuses end. Taking personal responsibility, even when you aren't directly at fault for the immediate crisis, is the required first step for fixing any broken situation. Which naturally leads us to a very logical question. Why cry over a city that wasn't paying his bills? Think about it. Nehemiah didn't even live in Jerusalem. He was living hundreds of miles away in Persia, serving the king. He had a great job, security, status, the whole shebang. It would have been so easy and completely justifiable for him to just sleep peacefully, ignore the bad news from a distant land, and just focus on his own comfortable life. But he didn't, and that's because he carried what we call a divine burden. Let's break this down. This is a purpose placed on the heart, meant to move you into action, not crush you, regardless of personal convenience. You see, true purpose is never measured by convenience. Some people sleep perfectly fine while their generation is falling apart, while others lose sleep because they carry a profound burden for it. Nehemiah carried that burden. Now, you might be thinking, okay, prayer is great, but isn't that just a lazy way to avoid doing actual hard work? Well, let's look at that skeptic directly.
That brings us to section 3, preparation, not escape. Moving from prayer to action.
And this brilliantly illustrates the balance Nehemiah struck. If you're using prayer to just avoid obedience and hard work, that is not faith. That's an escape. But on the flip side, if you try to just roll up your sleeves and rebuild without praying first, that's pure pride. Nehemiah didn't fall into either of these traps. He shows us that prayer doesn't replace the work. Rather, it prepares the worker. Let me walk you through this simple but incredibly powerful progression. Step 1, he prayed. Step 2, he planned. Step 3, he acted. It sounds basic, but it's profound. Prayer is exactly where responsibility receives its ultimate direction through this exact sequence. You can't skip step 1 because that's where the vision is born, but you absolutely can't stop at step 1 either because the vision requires hands and feet to become a reality. Let's move to and see how this builds in our next section. The power of silence, the waiting period. Okay, we are now entering arguably the most agonizing, suspenseful part of Nehemiah's story where absolutely nothing seemed to happen. After that initial desperate prayer, nothing. Look at this timeline. Month 1, silence. Month 2, silence. Month 3, absolute unbroken silence. For 4 long, painful months, there were no angels appearing in his room, no instant miracles, just pure silence, day in and day out. Until finally, in month 4, a seemingly ordinary question from the king changes everything. If you're in a waiting period right now, please remember this. Silence is not abandonment. It is divine preparation. While Nehemiah sat there thinking heaven was totally silent, God was actively, meticulously working behind the scenes where Nehemiah couldn't even see. And all that preparation culminated in this exact quote from the Persian king. For what dost thou make request? I mean, it looks like such an ordinary question, right? Just polite conversation. But it wasn't. It was the massive, history-changing door that heaven had spent 4 whole months scheduling just for Nehemiah. As we wrap up this explainer, let's lock in the core lessons from the Nehemiah strategy. Number 1, delay is not denial. That delay you've been dealing with might just be God arranging the king you need to meet. Number 2, when life falls apart, make your first conversation with God, not with people or Google. And number 3, really capturing the gist of his whole prayer strategy. Every great restoration begins with prayer. I want to leave you with this final provocative question to ponder the next time your own personal walls fall down. Will you let panic speak before prayer? It's a challenging thought for sure, but if we follow Nehemiah's lead, the answer might just change your history. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.